In 1820, a team of surveyors waded through knee-deep swamp water, pulled a compass from a leather satchel, and began marking out the streets of a future state capital on land that no one had asked for. Indianapolis is today the largest American city with no navigable waterway. That fact is so counterintuitive that most people, hearing it for the first time, assume it must be wrong. What makes it stranger is that the location was not a mistake. It was a deliberate decision, made by men who were more afraid of geography than they were of the wilderness they were standing in. Indiana became a state in 1816 with its capital at Corydon, a town pressed into the far southern corner of the state, near the Ohio River. As settlers spread north through the decade that followed, Corydon made less and less sense as a governing center. In January 1820, the Indiana General Assembly passed a law appointing 10 commissioners to find a new capital site. The instruction was precise and, in its way, radical. The site should be as near the center of the state as possible. That single phrase quietly eliminated every prosperous candidate. Jeffersonville, Madison, Lawrenceburg, all of them thriving Ohio River ports, were ruled out before the vote was taken. The center rule was not geographic logic. It was political fear. The fear was specific, that placing the capital near a navigable river would hand one city economic control over the entire state. The commissioners were drawn from different regions precisely to prevent any single faction from winning. Fairness, not practicality, was the design principle. Picture this. In May 1820, 10 commissioners stood at the edge of a river bend in dense forest, looking at a surveyor's map where a penciled cross marked the theoretical center of Indiana. They voted to build a city on a spot where the only structure in sight was a single settler's cabin half a mile upstream. The vote passed. The location was fixed, but the land itself had not agreed to anything, and it would resist every plan they made for it. The man hired to survey and design the new capital was Alexander Ralston, and his credentials for the job were unusual. In the 1790s, Ralston had worked as a junior assistant to Pierre Charles L'Enfant during the original layout of Washington, D.C. The city he was now being asked to design in an Indiana swamp would be, in direct geometry, a descendant of the federal capital. Ralston and his partner Elias Fordham arrived at the site in the spring of 1821 and spent weeks running transit lines through standing water and undergrowth. The plan Ralston produced was a 1-mile square centered on a circular roundabout, from which 4 diagonal avenues radiated outward at 45-degree angles, cutting across an otherwise rectangular grid. Think about what it looked like. Ralston standing at the precise geometric center of Indiana, holding a compass over a wooden stake driven into soft earth, the forest pressing in on every side, sketching the outline of a city that did not yet have a single permanent building. His field notes, preserved in the Indiana State Archives, include multiple references to stakes being driven into ground, described as too soft to hold. The geometry was precise. The ground beneath it was not. Ralston designated the central circle as the site of the governor's residence. That plan would not survive contact with the city it was meant to anchor, but the circle itself would outlast everything. The coordinate point he established in 1821 is still the center of modern downtown Indianapolis, with a 284-foot monument standing on it. The first non-native settler to establish a permanent home on the capital site was a man named John McCormick, who built a cabin near Fall Creek in late 1819. He was already living there when the commissioners voted to build a city around him. Step into that clearing in the autumn of 1821. A handful of log cabins arranged around a muddy track that the survey map calls Washington Street. The stumps of newly felled trees still in the road, and somewhere in the tree line the sound of axes. The city was being cut out of the forest, one tree at a time. Calvin Fletcher, one of the earliest lawyers to settle in Indianapolis, and one of the primary documentary sources for this period, wrote in his diary in 1821 that the streets of the new plan were lines through the forest. He meant it literally. The trees had not yet been cleared from the platted lots. The nearest trading post was at Connorsville, roughly 50 miles east, reachable only by trail. Several of the first families who arrived that winter found conditions worse than they had expected. A small number abandoned their claims and left. The city came very close to failing entirely in its first 12 months. When the Indiana legislature first convened in Indianapolis in January 1825, they met in a 2-story log structure on the southeast quadrant of the governor's circle. It measured roughly 40 by 60 feet. It had cost the state $2,800 to build. Imagine walking up to Governor's Circle in January 1827. The circular avenue is unpaved, frozen mud and wheel ruts, and the building at the center of Indiana's new capital is a log structure you could mistake for a large farmhouse, except for 2 men in long coats arguing in the doorway about a canal bill. Contemporary accounts describe the building as cold, leaking, and prone to flooding at the ground level. Governor James B. Ray called it inadequate to the dignity of the state in 1825. In his inaugural address delivered from inside it, the legislature voted to delay building a replacement, and then voted to delay it again. The log statehouse shared its lot with a tavern that operated in an adjacent building. Legislators would cross a common yard between the seat of state government and the only functioning drinking establishment in the new capital. Indiana governed itself from a leaking log cabin for 11 years, while debating, without resolution, whether it could afford to build something better. The building was demolished in 1835. Not a single structure from the original 1821 Indianapolis settlement survives above ground today. The city was so thoroughly replaced within a generation that the founding era exists now only in documents, survey plats, and diary entries. The canal question was the city's next confrontation with its own geography, and it nearly ended everything. In 1836, Indiana passed the Mammoth Internal Improvements Act, committing the state to building nearly 1,400 miles of canals and roads simultaneously. The centerpiece was the Central Canal, which was meant to run from the Wabash and Erie Canal southward through Indianapolis, finally connecting the landlocked capital to navigable water. The groundbreaking in Indianapolis was treated as a civic event, the moment the city would finally join the commercial world. The ceremony was held, the speeches were given, the shovels broke ground. By 1839, Indiana had spent roughly $9 million and was approaching default. The canal sections that had been built were plagued by engineering failures, shoddy construction, and the fundamental reality that the terrain between Indianapolis and the Wabash was far more difficult than surveyors had estimated. The short stretch of the Central Canal that actually reached Indianapolis never carried a single commercial cargo vessel. Indiana defaulted on its canal bonds in 1841, one of the first American states to default on public debt. The section of canal that was completed still exists today as the Indianapolis Canal Walk, a recreational waterway used by joggers and cyclists on summer afternoons. It is a pleasant place. It is not what anyone had in mind. The canal failure would have finished a lesser city, but Indianapolis survived it because something else had already arrived. The Madison and Indianapolis Railroad completed its line to the city in October 1847, connecting the landlocked capital southward to Madison on the Ohio River. It was the first railroad to reach Indianapolis, and it was followed by 7 more within a decade. Close your eyes for a moment and place yourself at the Indianapolis Depot in 1855. 8 rail lines converging from 8 compass points. The platforms crowded with passengers connecting between trains, the air heavy with coal smoke, and somewhere in the noise, the ghost of the 10 commissioners who thought they were building a backwater. The very quality that had made Indianapolis seem like a poor location turned out to be precisely what railroad companies wanted in a hub city. spokes need a center. The political logic of 1820, equidistance from everywhere, inadvertently created perfect railroad hub geometry 30 years later. By 1855, Indianapolis had become one of the most connected railroad junctions in the entire country, handling more through traffic than cities with far older commercial histories. The deliberate geographic uselessness of the location, chosen to prevent commercial dominance, had become the precise quality that made it commercially dominant. No one had planned this. The plan had simply run out, and the city had continued on its own. The geometry of 1821 still underlies everything. Walk to the center of Monument Circle today and consider what is beneath you. Below the pavement, below the granite, below the 284-foot monument completed in 1902, the coordinate point that Alexander Ralston established with a compass in standing water in 1821 is still exactly there. The 4 diagonal avenues he drew through the forest still cut across the modern city grid at 45-degree angles. Massachusetts Avenue, Indiana Avenue, Virginia Avenue, Kentucky Avenue. They create the angled intersections that confuse every first-time visitor to downtown Indianapolis. They were drawn that way in 1821 and have not moved. The original 1-mile square plan is still legible in the street names. North Street, South Street, East Street, West Street, the boundaries of Ralston's founding survey, survive as named roads in the modern city. The boundary roads of a plan drawn in a forest clearing are now 4 of the busiest commercial corridors in Indiana. Ralston's central circle was meant to hold the governor's residence. The governor eventually refused to live there, and the circle was given over to a monument instead, one of the tallest freestanding monuments in the United States. But the circle is still exactly where Ralston put it, and the coordinate at its center is still exactly the geometric center of Indiana, measured from its 1816 boundaries. The name Indianapolis was coined in 1821 by combining Indiana with polis, the Greek word for city. A contemporary newspaper described the name as sounding like a word that is trying too hard. Other proposed names did not survive. The awkward one did. Look at a satellite image of modern downtown Indianapolis and trace the diagonal lines of Massachusetts Avenue, Indiana Avenue, Virginia Avenue. 4 streets cutting at 45-degree angles through the rectangular grid, exactly as Ralston drew them in the mud in 1821. The man is gone. The log cabin is gone. The swamp is gone. The lines remain. The Indiana State Archives hold the most complete record of what the original city was. Ralston's survey plat. The commissioners' meeting minutes from 1820. Calvin Fletcher's diary covering 45 years of the city's early life. A small number of sketches made by early settlers. No photographs exist. The city predates photography by nearly 2 decades. John McCormick, the first settler on the Capitol site, died in 1832 and was buried in a small cemetery that the expanding city eventually surrounded on all sides. His grave is one of the oldest marked sites in Indianapolis. He was already living on the land when the decision was made to build a capital around him, and he did not live to see it become one. Indianapolis was designed to be nowhere in particular, a political compromise rendered in survey coordinates, a city whose founding logic was the absence of natural advantage. It became, through stubbornness and infrastructure, and a railroad boom it did not anticipate, a city of nearly 1 million people. The log cabin is gone. The canal silted over and was turned into a walking path. The swamp was drained and paved and built upon until no trace of it remained. What cannot be recovered is the specific strangeness of that moment in 1821, when a surveyor stood in standing water and began measuring out the streets of a city that had no reason to be there and turned out to be right.